Okay, well, hello and welcome back to this series of lectures about the Exalted Treatise on the response of the Tao. By way of recap, let's take a look at the passages that we've already discussed. So, the Exalted Treatise on the response of the Tao. The Exalted One states, there are no gates to good fortune and misfortune. They simply arise from one's conduct. The outcomes of reward and retribution are as shadow follows form. This is because there are spirits in heaven and on earth oversee one's misdeeds. And based on the gravity of the offences, one's lifespan is reduced by units of 100 days. Now, there are two particular points to take away from the idea that one's life expectancy is reduced. The first thing is that it's related to the Taoist belief that when a person is born, they're actually allotted a certain amount of years of life, along with many aspects of their life experience. So it could be, the social status that they will achieve, the different jobs that they will attain, in terms of family, things like how many children that they will have, many things like that. And they believe that it can be calculated, one's forecast at birth can be calculated by reference to a person's time and date and year of birth. But importantly, that forecast or that life destiny, if you will, is not set in stone. So, for example, a person could be destined to a life of poverty, but if they commit themselves to performing good deeds, they work very hard, well, they may change their destiny and they may actually end up being, well off and, comfortably well off. So that destiny changes based on a person's, thoughts and deeds during their life. And it's the same applies to how long a person actually lives. So, for example, a person who was born with an allotment of 50 years, if they committed misdeeds, well, they will have their lifespan reduced, as we've read, by units of 100 days. These units add up, and they may not actually live to see their 50th birthday. A person could be born with a much higher allotment. Let's say they were destined to live to 100 years. If they commit the same misdeeds, well, their lifespan will also be reduced. And they may only end up living up to 60 or 70 years of age. And that's sort of related to how sometimes we might see people committed misdeeds, seemingly able to get away scot-free. Or even profiting from their misdeeds, as we've discussed before. And this is because they are still enjoying the good fortune accumulated from their prior good deeds. And this might have taken place, many years before we even knew that person, or even from a previous lifetime. So they won't remember and we won't know. But it can be guaranteed that as soon as those merits are completely used up, they will start to feel the negative effects of their misdeeds. And that's bound to happen, as sure as shadow follows form. The other point to note is that all living beings essentially value their life. They want to keep on living and staying alive. So sort of the fact that the Exalted Treatise from the very start draws our attention to the fact that our lifespan, our life can be reduced because of our misdeeds, it sort of makes the reader really sit up and pay attention. All right, so what we're going to do today is read on and cover two passages. The first passage tells us what happens to us when our lifespan gets reduced because of any misdeeds we might have committed. What does that feel like? And then the second passage tells us a little bit more about these all-seeing spirits that oversee our conduct, especially our misdeeds. So let's read on. And the next passage states, as 100-day units are deducted, one will incur poverty and depletion. One will encounter much distress and troubles. One becomes generally despised, suffer penalty and misfortune. One will know no joy or happiness, but be tormented by natural or man-made disasters. Once one's 100-day units are exhausted, life ends. So there are a whole series of unfortunate events that happen to a person, that can happen to a person if they have committed misdeeds and their lifespan gets reduced. Well, first up, they incur poverty and depletion. Well, depletion really means running out. Their supplies, their resources run out, or they're wasted away. And this is certainly not limited to just economic resources, but I suppose this part of the passage was really geared towards the fact that they will really struggle to make ends meet. It becomes very difficult maybe to even just put food on the table. So they will suffer on the economic front. But it's not just limited to suffering on the economic front. On a psychological level, they encounter much distress and troubles. And what sort of distress? Maybe they could be plagued by worries and stressed out. Troubles could be, all sorts of accidents happen to them. And there's actually a historical account linked to this particular part of this passage from the commentary on the Exalted Treatise. And it's about a merchant by the name of Xu Xing. He lived in what is now known as Suzhou City in China. And he was basically a wholesaler of the herbs used in traditional Chinese medicine. And he sold these herbs to the clinics, the doctors, the shops. So he was like a wholesale distributor. And he made a fortune. So he got very rich, but he was an extremely greedy person. And unfortunately, he got rich by basically forcing people, shops, to buy his stock, taking advantage and basically cheating people left, right, and center. So what happened to him? Why is his story linked to this particular part of the passage? Well, we know that one time he was traveling. He was on his way to a region called Liaodong to sell some ginseng. He had on him a considerable amount of money, his savings, and unfortunately, he was attacked by robbers on the road. So they basically took everything that he had on him, and he was lucky to escape with his life. Now, some people might say, well, that could just be wrong time, wrong place. But that wasn't all that happened to him. Later on, we know that he traveled to Shandong province, which is where Confucius comes from. And there he runs into an old enemy, basically a rival. And this person accuses him of being a member of a secret society known for stirring up political rebellion. So a really serious criminal offense. And they had him reported to the authorities, and poor Xu Xing was taken away for questioning, formal interrogation by the law enforcement, like the police in that area. And the long and short of it was basically it took almost all of the money that he had to be able to get out of being framed, essentially. And that was another waste of particularly large sum of his money. So another depletion, you could say. And another time, he was actually traveling home from Sichuan province. He was traveling by boat, and the boat got attacked by pirates. He had to abandon everything, his money, his valuables, just everything, just to be able to get home in one piece. So he was terribly misfortunate. When he got home, things just went bad to worse in terms of his family situation, their economic situation, and the whole family went from bad to worse. And Xu Xing was worried. He was worried about himself, his business, his family, about the future. He became terribly depressed and he died from illness. So, if you add it all up, here is a person who got rich by wheeling and dealing. And it's about 3 times that he basically lost everything that he had on him by being robbed on the roads, on the borders, being framed. And then 2 of those times, he almost lost his life and, ended up dying from illness. So that gives you a sense of the sort of experiences, what happens when a person's life gets reduced. Not only are they down and out of luck, they become generally despised. That means sort of disliked by everyone. It's like no one can stand the sight of them, basically. And they could be ignored by everyone or even ostracized by the people around them. Now, sometimes it might seem these days that people can commit some misdeeds and they get away with it scot-free, but they're not despised. In fact, they could even become really popular. Does that mean that the law of cause and effect doesn't apply to them? Well, the answer is no. Sometimes it could be that they find themselves surrounded by people who are really seeking to profit from their, temporary fame and fortune, and seeking to profit from gains and to benefit themselves. So are they really popular? I'm not sure. Not just that. So there's the poverty and depletion, encountering much misfortune, distress, and becoming generally despised. The person might actually suffer penalty and misfortune as well. Penalties could be things like fines or, being sent to jail. Misfortunes are things like, missing out on the good things, like being overlooked for a job promotion, for example. There's an historical account, this time not about a merchant, but a government official, a fairly senior government official. His name was Liang Tong, and he actually lived 2,000 years ago in a time known as the latter Han Dynasty in China. So he was the palace counselor, so a fairly senior official, and he wrote a formal recommendation to the emperor at the time. He was recommending to the emperor to reinstate the harsh laws of the past. Basically, he was motivated by cruel intentions, and he was advocating that the criminal sanctions be made more onerous and there be less frequent amnesties. An amnesty is when the emperor grants a general pardon to past offences. So he was advocating for the opposite. So there shouldn't be, amnesties only take place really very occasionally. And he thought, well, that was far too often already. So he was advocating for basically things to become more harsh and onerous all around. What did the emperor do? The emperor called a court conference, with other officials and discussed and debated the merits of, this particular recommendation. But they came to the conclusion that actually that didn't need to be followed. The criminal regulations, the law and order situation was really fine as it is. So that particular recommendation by Liang Tong was not followed. It was not accepted. But that wasn't the end of the matter, certainly not for him, because not long after that, he actually had a dream. In this dream, there was a spirit, and the spirit told him, said, your request to reinstate the harsh laws of the past would have meant, brought much suffering to countless people. Even though the emperor didn't take up your recommendation, your misdeeds have been recorded. You wished that other people would suffer harsh penalties like the death sentence, for example. And that means that you and your family will not be able to avoid the same. Now, bear in mind, Liang Tong, he was far from retirement age. He was still working, he was the palace counselor, but less than 2 years after that dream, he passed away. And he was survived by his son and daughters. So what happened to his children? Well, his son was accused of treachery and sent to prison, and he actually died in prison. His daughters committed suicide, so they actually ended their life prematurely. And all of the members of his household were basically exiled to the far south. So the far south was, in those times, a fairly undeveloped region. But the misfortune didn't end there. In fact, his great-grandson, he was called Liang Ji. Liang Ji actually became an extremely influential statesman, so he was also serving as a government official, a senior government official. But because he monopolized the authority of the imperial court, because of those offences, he became stripped of his offices, his titles, so he lost all of his great social status, and he was to be exiled to the far south as well. But before that happened, him and his wife actually took their own lives. And all of their family members, their friends, their associates were arrested, and then they were either put to death or prescribed from office. So it was basically misfortunes all around. And, there were basically no more Liang family members left. So the government sold off all of the Liang family property. And the fact that the proceeds came to some $3 billion cash in, the currency of those days, sort of shows you how much was, was appropriated by the government, basically. So Liang Tong, his cruel recommendation had far-reaching, terrible consequences for himself, for his family, and even their associates. And it was, for over several generations as well. And I think there are sort of similarities, parallels, if you like, with Wei Zhongda. If you remember Wei Zhongda's story, he was a young government official in his 30s, and he had accumulated so many misdeeds that the records of those misdeeds actually filled up virtually, an entire hall. But like Liang Tong, Wei Zhongda had submitted a formal recommendation, a memorial to his emperor, and he recommended that the emperor not sort of proceed with a construction project for a stone bridge that spans something like 3 mountains, out of compassion for the enormous cost and human labor. So he was motivated by, compassion and just taking pity on the poor people who were called upon to serve in this particular public project. Well, even though, like Liang Tong, his emperor didn't follow his recommendation, there was considerable merit still in the sincerity with which he wrote that memorial, and the fact that, that document served as a positive example for others. So if you remember, that one scroll containing a copy of his memorial actually outweighed all of the misdeeds that he had accumulated to date, because of all of his improper thoughts. Well, Liang Tong, he made a recommendation. The recommendation wasn't followed, but his cruel intentions motivating that particular recommendation gave rise to, terrible implications, consequences for himself and his family for several generations. And that gives us some idea of the line, suffering penalty and misfortunes. Okay, but the passage doesn't stop there, does it? On top of all of that, you have the poverty and distress, and then being generally despised, suffering penalty and misfortune. The text goes on to say that the person will know no joy or happiness. So basically, nothing goes according to their plans. They don't get anything that they wish for. So, for example, it could be they're trying to grow fruits and vegetables in their garden and they get nothing but weeds. Underlying reason is because they've actually sowed only the seeds of misfortune. So you can't really enjoy the good fortune unless you've cultivated the good deeds, as we've established right from the beginning. So they know no joy nor happiness, and instead they're tormented by natural and man-made disasters. So if you read the Chinese literally, there's actually a reference to baleful stars, and these are constellations in the sky that, according to Chinese folklore and Taoist belief, they're considered to be responsible for administering sort of natural disasters, things like floods, drought, earthquakes, etc. But not just the natural disasters, but personal misfortune as well. So illness, economic loss and ruin, that sort of thing. And so, in today's terms, it could be having a person having their house damaged or flooded by the storm. Some houses are more affected more severely than others. It could be a person losing their job in a corporate redundancy. That's a man-made misfortune. Or, they park their car on the street and someone crashes into their car. So all sorts of disasters, basically. Now, there's actually a good story, not about a merchant or a government official, but a student who aspires to become a government official. And the student's name is Wang Sheng, and we know that he's a rather dishonest character, someone who's a bit fraudulent, devious, but he aspires to be a government official. And so he prepares to sit the civil service examinations. And there are sort of like a series of examinations that ultimately, if you were to pass, would qualify you to be eligible to be chosen for a role in the government bureaucracy to become a government official. So Wang Shen, he prepares and he sits the civil service examinations. And he actually writes a very outstanding essay. The chief examiner is so impressed by his exceptional essay that he's keen to pass him. So include his name, Wang Shen's name, on the list of the successful candidates. Okay, so the chief examiner, he's finalizing the list of successful candidates, but strangely, he can't seem to find Wang Shen's exam paper. So it looks everywhere. It's nowhere to be found. So without the supporting documentation, he can't actually include Wang Shen's name on the list of those who pass the civil service examination, which was, terrible. He was someone who was very talented, obviously, and deserved to pass. But unfortunately, his name doesn't get added to the list because his exam paper goes missing. It's only after they've finalized the list, so everything's completed, that his exam paper is actually found. So you can imagine how regretful the chief examiner felt really sorry for Wang Shen. He sort of missed out and so deserved a place on that list of successful candidates. Well, he feels so sorry for the poor fellow that the chief examiner actually meets up with Wang Shen in private and assures him that he'll find a way to make it up to him. Okay, so later on, the chief examiner is actually appointed to the Ministry for Personnel. Now, this is the government department that's specifically responsible for recruiting new government officials, and was also responsible for appraising the work of government officials for their promotion or demotion. And when the time came for the next round of civil service examinations, Wang Shen, he came to resit. This is his second attempt. And the chief examiner is all too happy to see him. In fact, the chief examiner is actually appointed to be the person to select the successful candidates. So, the chief examiner meets up with Wang Shen again and assures him that he will personally add his name to the successful list of successful candidates to give him the recognition that he deserves. Well, so the examinations take place, then the papers have to be marked, and when the time comes to writing out, choosing the successful candidates, what happens? The father of the chief examiner passes away. And what that means is the chief examiner has to immediately resign from his official position and return home away from the capital where he worked, returning to his hometown to mourn for his father for 3 years. And that was the customary thing to do. The mourning period was 3 years. So he had to be absent. He was no longer, in a position to help Wang Shen out. Well, it's now, 3 years later. So already 5 years has passed since Wang Shen first attempted the civil service examination. But the good news is that the chief examiner has completed the mourning period for his late father. By chance, he is reappointed to the same position. So he has responsibility for selecting the successful candidates again. And then Wang Shen, he, comes to resit the civil service examinations for a third time. Okay, so the chief examiner, again, is in the best position to advance Wang Shen's career. And so Wang Shen sits the examinations. The chief examiner adds his name to the list of successful candidates and specifically assigns him a plum job. So a very prestigious role in the government bureaucracy, and one with a very good high income as well. But only days later, Wang Shen's mother passes away, and now it's his turn to have to resign and return home for 3 years to mourn for his mother. Now, at this point, the chief examiner, he sort of made a promise to Wang Shen, and he's really tried to keep his word. And he's a man of integrity. He's a government officer, but he's really at a loss as to how to help out this poor fellow. It's now going to be 8 years by the time he finishes mourning period for his late mother. And so, the chief examiner, he comes up with the idea of recommending him to be the tutor for the family of the Inspector General, so a fairly high up official. And being the tutor, they'd be responsible for educating his children and grandchildren, for example. That would be a very prestigious, respectable role with a very good salary as well. So he puts Wang Shen's name forward to the Inspector General, and the Inspector General accepts the recommendation. So things are looking up again. Wang Shen, after the end of the 3 years of the mourning period, he has a really good job to look forward to, to be the tutor for the family of the Inspector General. Well, what happens is that barely a month later, the Inspector General is dismissed from his job. So he's no longer in a position to, appoint Wang Shen to be the tutor anymore. He's no longer the Inspector General. So by this time, he had a good job waiting for him, but that falls through. You can imagine how devastated Wang Shen is. He's ambitious, young scholar, and it's going to be about 8 years by the time he finishes the mourning period for his mother, and his career has not gone anywhere. So, the first time his exam paper goes missing and he ends up not passing. Second time, the chief examiner's father passes away, can't really advance Wang Shen. Third time, he is appointed to a position, but I'm not sure if he even started the job before he's had to resign and return home to mourn for his late mother. And now, this great job that he was looking forward to also falls through. So, he's completely devastated. And, to make matters worse, as if things couldn't get any worse, Wang Shen is actually struck by illness. He becomes very ill, to the extent that he's actually bedridden for the next 3 years. So, lying in bed, he's got a lot of time to think about his life and what he's done with his life. And one day he realizes that actually all of the setbacks that he suffered over all of these years, they were really due to his own accumulated faults. He couldn't blame anyone or anything. And he realizes this, and he sort of commits himself to changing his ways. He actually wants to improve his ways. So, interestingly, when he makes up his mind to changing and improving himself, he starts to recover from his illness. And, well, we don't know whether he ended up being a government official in the end, but we do know that he spent the rest of his life, so he recovered eventually from his illness, and he spent the rest of his life performing good deeds. So he did sort of keep that promise to himself to change. And I suppose, looking back at his experience, time and again, he had, very fortunate circumstances, but each time they, became misfortunate. It was as if he was trapped in a cycle of misfortune, trapped by his own misdeeds. And all of the things that happened to him, the exam paper going missing, right through to the Inspector General losing the job and his own good job falling through, and including his illness, you could say that they were sort of like warning signs, alerting him of the need to change, to improve. Because, as we said in the beginning, he had been a very dishonest character. So, the good news is that if a person is willing to change and improve their ways, the spirits oversee people's conduct. They know straight away, immediately, and they're able to be supportive. As we know from Wang Shen, as soon as he sort of made up his mind to change his ways, he started getting better from his illness, the illness that had kept him bedridden for 3 years. So it was a serious illness. And the other interesting thing to take away is that, clearly he was very talented, but becoming a government official in those days was more than a matter of talent. A government official needed to have good ethical character as well as outstanding ability, because, they were responsible for serving the state, all the people in the state. So, with someone like Wang Shen, who was very talented, but not getting anywhere in their career, well, there was probably some good reasons why. Now, what happens if a person doesn't change? Well, the text tells us that if they continue to commit misdeeds, well, their lifespan will continue to be deducted. they're units of 100 days, but that's actually the smallest unit. And they will eventually maybe run out of those units, and that's when their life comes to an untimely end. So that's why, as soon as those 100-day units are exhausted, life ends. Now, some people might ask, well, how do we actually go about, sincerely changing, making that commitment to improving ourselves? Well, I suppose there are three fundamental things to bear in mind. First is to acknowledge where we've gone wrong, admit our faults to ourselves, to be honest and reflecting on ourselves, and obviously apologizing, saying sorry to the people affected, if that is possible. It's not always possible. So that's the first point. Second is actually changing and not repeating the same mistakes. So saying sorry is just an empty word if we continue to just continue as we were. And then finally, it's really important to sort of get to the root of the matter, changing from the level of our thoughts and getting right to the bottom of why it is that we gave rise to the improper thoughts that lead us to commit those misdeeds in the very first place. So sort of those three fundamental things, I suppose, are good things to bear in mind in terms of really sincerely committing to changing our ways. Okay, well, what happens if we saw someone we know who seems to run into one misfortune after another? We can't tell if actually their lifespan is getting reduced. What would Confucius say? How would Confucius advise? Well, in those sorts of circumstances, it may not always be possible for us to offer words of advice. It depends on the relationship, with our relationship with that particular person, if they trust us enough to listen to us, listen to our words of advice. But what we can do is obviously reflect on their faults. We can make sure that we don't do the same thing, and we try to set the right example, a positive example. At the end of the day, our actions speak louder than words. So that's often the very best way to really show them the way, instead of just, pointing a finger, because it's really sad sometimes. They may not even know that they're sowing the seeds for misfortune. Now, even with the many spirits and deities overseeing a person's conduct and administering all the rewards and punishment, is it actually possible for them to, give more good fortune and maybe less of the misfortune to any person? Can they actually do that? Well, the answer is no. They can't do any more than what that person actually deserves. So it's really up to the person themselves to improve their life fortunes by improving their thoughts and deeds. So as we mentioned from the very first talk, we are in the driver's seat in terms of our own life destiny. So whatever original allotment we might have had at birth, there's it's within our capacity to improve on that and make the changes that we need to. Well, let's read on in the text. The next passage tells us, also, spirit lords of the northern constellations dwell above the heads of human beings. Recording human misdeeds, they reduce lifespans in units from 100 days to 12 years. So the 100-day units were actually the smallest. So 100 days is already a third of a year. It's not an inconsiderable number. So I've actually got a diagram to help us think about these northern constellations. I'm going to share this PowerPoint. Hope that everyone can see. So the northern constellations that are referred to in this passage, there are two. One is called the three altars, and they're basically three pairs of stars. And if we start from the lower altar, these two pairs of stars here are, according to Taoist belief, they're sort of responsible for a person's income, their wealth, or lack thereof. And then the middle altar, these two stars, they're responsible for a person's good fortune, their fortunes in life. And then the upper altar is responsible for a person's lifespan. Then the other constellation, and this is quite well known, it's more easily observable from the northern, the night sky in the northern hemisphere. It's called the Big Dipper, or the Dipper. And it's this set of 7 stars. And together, you could say that these constellations are considered to be responsible for, the Dipper itself is sort of the guardians of virtue. And together with the 3 altars, these constellations are considered to be responsible for granting a person longevity, that's long life, or reducing their lifespan. And the lifespan gets reduced by units of 100 days for minor misdeeds, and periods up to 12 years for major misdeeds. Okay, so I'll just turn off this, stop the screen sharing. Okay, well, there's a historical account that sort of shows us how this works. And this comes from the late 7th century in Tang Dynasty, China. And it's a story of a rather well-known government official by the name of Lou Shide. And he was the chief minister. So if you remember, there are basically 6 ministries. I mentioned the Ministry of Personnel before, but he was the chief of all of the ministers, all of the 6 ministers. And basically this was the top official job that you could have. It's basically one level down from the emperor himself. Well, Lou Shide was the chief minister from the year 697. And he was known for being a very kind, very respectful person who conducted themselves in a very careful and considered way. That's just the person that he was. You could sort of see this in the way that he interacted with his younger brother. So one time his younger brother was actually posted to a role as the head of the Dai prefecture, so a certain region, to be the head of that region in regional government. And so before the younger brother departs, Lou Shide sort of advises him. He sort of tells his younger brother, look, I'm a little bit worried about you, that you'll, contend with others and get into strife all the way out there. And to reassure Lou Shide, his younger brother says to him, even if a person were to spit on my face, I would simply wipe it away. So he wouldn't retaliate or do anything to aggravate that person. So his younger brother is saying, well, you've warned me, I'm going to be prepared, and I'll be patient and tolerant and, really look out for myself. But what does Lou Shide say? He says, well, actually, that won't do at all. If someone were to spit into your face, they're going to be they must be extremely angry. And if you were to wipe it away, that's really going against their intentions, isn't it? Right? So that's just going to provoke them to maybe feel even more angry and retaliate with violence, maybe. So you're better off just letting it dry by itself. That way, you'll protect yourself from further harm. So as Lo Shide was warning his younger brother, look, don't be too quick to act. Don't sort of provoke someone who's already angry to do anything worse. So we start to get a picture of the sort of person that he is, someone who is extremely patient and tolerant. Now, he was also a person who practiced what he preached. How do we know this? Well, Lo Shide had a colleague by the name of Di Rinzie, who's the same age as him. And this colleague always gave him a hard time. He would criticize Lo Shide, disparage him in front of others, and I think even one time ordered for Lo Shide to be sent away, to some place abroad to be an ambassador, to get him out of the capital. So for some reason, just didn't like the sight of him. But all this time, throughout it all, Lo Shide has never said a negative word about Di Rinzie, the person who's always on his case. And he doesn't retaliate in any way. In fact, Lo Shide actually writes a letter of formal recommendation, recommending to the sovereign that Di Rinzie be promoted to be the chief minister, to take over his job. You could recognize, even though that person criticized him endlessly, Lo Shide was someone who could be impartial, and he recognized that person had, really good talent, should, use their talents, be in a position to use their talents to really serve the state. So he makes that recommendation, and the recommendation is accepted and implemented. So Di Rinzie is promoted to be the chief minister, taking over from Lo Shide. Well, at the time, the sovereign happened to be a lady, and by the name of known as Wu Zetian. She was actually the only woman to rule as a sovereign in the whole history of China. So as Di Rinzie, as the new chief minister, one day he has an audience with the empress, Wu Zetian, and he's actually asked by the empress, do you know why you were promoted to this, your current position as the chief minister? And Di Rinzie sort of answers right away, well, of course, it's because of my great character, my excellent abilities, including my writing abilities, etc., etc. And there's a pause in the conversation. The empress doesn't answer him right away. But when she does get to giving him an answer, she sort of explains that actually, I promoted you to this position, but I didn't actually know anything about you at all. And she sort of signals to the attendants to bring out the documentation. They lay out the papers in front of Di Rinzie, and he's really surprised. He can see, over 10 letters, recommendation letters, written by Lo Shide, the person that he's always giving a hard time, always criticizing. Lo Shide has actually written over 10 letters formally recommending him to be promoted to be chief minister. And, in his wildest dreams, he would never have thought that, the person that he was so mean to would actually do this for him. So he feels terribly ashamed of his own conduct, and he apologizes profusely to the empress. And from then on, Di Rinzie has nothing but the utmost admiration for Lo Shide, for, his having such a forgiving and magnanimous nature, and, having the heart to forgive, not to hold personal grudges, basically, not to let these personal grudges get in the way of public service. So from then on, he has nothing but the highest admiration for his colleague. Lo Shide. Now back to Lo Shide. What happened to him, and why is his story associated with this particular passage? Well, one day, Lo Shide, he wakes up and he sees a spirit official from the northern constellations that we've just read about. And the spirit official tells him that, in the past, you accidentally, by mistake, took the lives of 2 people. So maybe as the chief minister, incorrectly sentenced 2 people to be, put to death by accident, and certainly wasn't a deliberate error. Well, 2 people's lives have been lost, and for this offence, your own lifespan will be reduced by 12 years. The most serious offences will incur the 12 years, and actually you won't have very much longer to live. 12 years is a huge deduction from anyone's lifespan. Well, Lo Shide, he sort of feels very tired that day, and he tells the people around him what the spirit said, and sure enough, he passes away very shortly after. Well, this was Lo Shide, someone who is known for being level-headed and for being very careful and cautious, being very considered in everything that he did throughout his life. But his experience sort of tells us 3 things. The first is that good deeds, a person's good deeds, does not cancel out their misdeeds. So as we read from the very first talk, the outcomes, the consequences will be guaranteed, for better or worse. These good deeds do not cancel the bad deeds. The second thing is that his experience really shows us that it's all the more important to be careful and considered in what we think and do. So we would do well to follow his strengths. But I suppose the biggest takeaway is that it's never too early to start learning more and educating ourselves about the principles for right and wrong behaviours. In terms of the law of cause and effect, there's no better thing than prevention. So I'll leave you with that thought today. And next week, we'll look more into the other types of spirit officials that, oversee our every move. But then we'll also hopefully be able to cover the good deeds. These are things that we should really look out for in what we do on a day-to-day basis to accumulate the good deeds for good fortune. So I want to thank you very much for your kind attention, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. So thank you very much indeed.